They didn't bar her because she couldn't handle what was in that room. They barred her because she could. And that scared somebody sitting at a table that had never once seen a firefight, never pulled a wounded man by the collar through 6 inches of mud, never made the kind of call that follows you into sleep for the rest of your natural life. Lieutenant Selah Marks had done all 3 by the time she was 26. She stood outside that briefing room door, not pacing, not trembling. Not making a scene, just standing, the way a person stands when they've already decided how this ends and they're just waiting for the building to catch up. I watched her from the end of the hall, notebook-like, open, pen clicking in my left hand the way it does when I'm writing something I don't want to write. Here's what I knew about her before any of this started. She'd held a position in Kandahar for 11 hours with 4 men and a radio that worked intermittently at best. But she'd called in her own coordinates once, not because she panicked, but because it was the only move left that made mathematical sense. She walked out. Her guys walked out. The after-action report described it as tactically unconventional. I describe sort of it as the thing I think about when someone tells me there are rules for how wars get won. This is the story of the day they locked the door on Selah Marks. And the colonel who made them open it back up. What happened in that room afterward, and in the valley 12 hours later, I'm still not sure I've the right words for. But I basically wrote it down anyway. I always write it down. The pen wouldn't sort of stop clicking. I'd been doing it for 11 minutes. I know, because I log things. I log everything. It's the one habit that survived 4 deployments and a divorce and 2 separate attempts by superior officers to confiscate my notebooks. In those 11 minutes, Captain Derek Ploss had walked past the briefing room door 4 times, each pass a little slower than the last, like he was working himself up to something he hadn't fully decided on yet. I was leaning against the far wall of the corridor with my notebook propped on my forearm. The hallway smelled like diesel and whatever chemical they use to clean institutional linoleum that never actually makes institutional linoleum feel clean. The fluorescent tube above me had a flutter to it, every 3 seconds, a stutter of light that made the whole hallway feel like a place where things were about to go wrong. Lieutenant Selah Marks was still standing at the door. She, hadn't moved in. 9 of those 11 minutes, back straight, hands at her sides, the kind of stillness that's impatience. It's calculation. Her hair was pulled back hard enough that you could read the tension in her jaw from 20 feet. And she was still in her field kit, and she hadn't even pulled her vest off. Dried mud on her left boot, from the heel to mid-lace, the color of the valley we'd all just spent 3 days pretending to survey. Ploss made his 5th pass. "Lieutenant." He said it like it was a complete sentence, like it answered something she'd asked. "The briefing is classified at a level that—" "I've clearance at that level." Her voice was flat, not angry. The kind of, a flat that comes after angry has been used up on more important things. "Captain, I've worked this sector for—" "The decision was made above my pay grade." He stopped walking. He looked at the middle distance the way officers do when they need you to believe they have no power over a thing they absolutely have power over. "I'm just communicating the parameters." Selah looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked back at the door. Ploss walked away. I watched him go, and then I wrote communicating the parameters in my notebook and underlined it twice, because language like that doesn't happen accidentally. Language like that's a small violence dressed up as administrative procedure. I clicked my pen. Here's what I guess, knew about what was behind that door. Operation Terrace. 26 hours out. A strike on a supply corridor in the eastern approach to the Sari Pol district. Running through a valley the locals called something I could never pronounce correctly, and which appeared on our maps under a grid designation that told you exactly nothing about the terrain. The corridor had been active for 6 weeks, 3, pretty much. Previous attempts to disrupt it had produced 2 dead, 1 MIA, and a report so full of redactions it looked like an abstract painting. The briefing was the fourth attempt's planning session. Sela Marx had been in that valley, and had been in it twice, had drawn its topography from memory on a whiteboard 6 days ago for a different set of officers who'd nodded, then apparently lost the whiteboard information somewhere between the meeting room and this one. She, TBH, was the only person in this FOB who had stood on that ground and come back. They had, well, locked her out of the room. I wrote that down too. The straight fact of it, no framing. Sometimes the straight fact is the most brutal thing in the notebook. Colonel Yusuf Adeyemi arrived at 0943. I heard him before I saw him, not because he was loud, but because the quality of the ambient noise in the hallway changed. People started moving with more purpose. 2 privates who'd been half leaning against a supply crate suddenly had places to be. Even the fluorescent flutter seemed to straighten itself out for a few seconds. He was tall in the way that some men are tall and make you forget to notice it. Not imposing, just present. Silver at both temples. The kind of face that had been weathered into something that looked less like age and more like evidence. He was reading a folder while he walked, which I'd seen him do before, and he had the particular talent of reading while walking through a crowded corridor without slowing down or looking up once. He looked up when he saw Sela. Not dramatically, I think, just registered her. Registered the door she was standing beside. Plus, registered for what it's worth. Odd that she wasn't inside it. Kind of. He closed the folder. Lieutenant Marx. Sir? He glanced at the door handle. Then at her. Something moved through his expression that I couldn't fully name. Not quite anger, not quite recognition. Something in between those two, which is maybe where all the most important things live. Why are you standing in the hallway? A beat. I was told the briefing was, I know what you were told. He said it without heat. To be fair, pure information. I'm basically asking why you're standing in the hallway and not in my office lodging a formal objection. Sela Marx blinked. It was the first involuntary thing I'd seen her do in 11 minutes. I didn't think that would... Come with me. He turned. She followed. I wrote 0943, and then I wrote something is about to shift, and then I crossed out the second line because it was too editorial, and I try to keep the notebook factual. But I left the cross-out visible because sometimes the crossed-out thing is also true. I didn't go to Adeyemi's office. I'm not important enough to be in Adeyemi's office, and I know my own weight. I stayed in the hallway. Ploss came back at 0951 and stood in front of the briefing room door and looked at the space where Sela had been standing with an expression like a man who suspects he made a mistake, but hasn't decided whether to own it or outrun it. He went into the briefing room at 0953. Adeyemi arrived at the briefing room door at 10:07. Sela was 2 steps behind him. He opened the door without knocking. The voices inside stopped with the particular abruptness of a record scratch, which is an old reference, but it's accurate. Ploss was at the head of the table. 6 others, 2 I recognized from the S2 shop, 1 logistics officer, 2 from the attached unit I didn't know well, and Major Dina Farrell, who I'd worked with in Helmond, and who met my eyes through the open door with an expression that said she was cautiously interested in how this was going to go. Gentlemen, Adeyemi said, not loud. He didn't need volume. Plus, I've reviewed the exclusion order on Lieutenant Marx, and I found no operational justification for it. She's in. He paused just long enough for it to mean something. If someone in this room has a problem with that, they're welcome to walk with me to the CG's office right now and explain their reasoning. Nobody walked. Ploss opened his mouth. Good, said Adeyemi. He stepped back to let Sela through the door, and then he walked to the empty chair at the far end of the table and sat down and reopened his folder. Sela walked in. Plus, she didn't look at Ploss, didn't look around the room for allies or evidence of the ambush that had just been dismantled on her behalf. She sat in the nearest available chair, pulled out a map she'd been carrying folded against her side, and smoothed it flat on the table in front of her. "The Western approach," she said, before anyone had asked her anything, before anyone had reoriented enough to speak. "Plus, every attempt on this corridor has come from the Eastern or Northern approach. You lose the element of surprise and you pick up 500 meters of exposed ground. And the Western approach runs a ridgeline that nobody's looked at because it reads as unnavigable on the aerial." She put her finger on the map. "It's not." Silence. "I walked it 18 months ago." She didn't look up. In November, night temps were -14. With a 30-kilo pack, it's navigable. Ploss said, The aerial is wrong." She said it without flinching, which is harder than it sounds when you're a lieutenant correcting a room full of higher-ranking officers who just tried to lock you out. "The aerial doesn't capture the shelf formation at grid 44 Bravo. There's a natural covered approach for the first 2/3 of the ridgeline. The exposure window is maybe 400 meters, not the 1,400 the imagery suggests." Major Farrell leaned forward. "Show me." And honestly, I got what came next secondhand. From Farrell. So from one of the S2 captains, from Adeyemi's aide, who is a serious and meticulous person who I believe to be constitutionally incapable of embellishment. What I got was this. Selah spent 40 minutes walking that room through the topography of a valley she'd memorized, not because she was asked to, but because she'd been cold and scared and rained on, and she'd paid attention anyway. She identified 3 points where previous operations had been compromised. Not through analysis, through memory. And this is where the second element took contact because the ridge amplifies sound, and anyone in the saddle at this point can hear approach from 600 meters. She said it like she was reading from a document. She didn't have a document. Ploss interrupted her twice. Adeyemi let her answer both times. Didn't intervene, didn't run interference. Plus, just let her carry the weight. Which is a different kind of respect than what Ploss had been performing with his walking past the door routine. By the end of the 40 minutes, the operational approach had been restructured around her ridgeline. By the end of the 40 minutes, Ploss had stopped interrupting. She came out at 11:31. The hallway was mostly empty by then. I was still there. I'd gone through basically 2 pages of notes, a cup of coffee from the urn at the end of the corridor. And that I describe in my notebook as functionally coffee, because it's the color and temperature of coffee, but none of the actual qualities, and 3 episodes of the fluorescent flutter. Selah came out. Honestly. Plus, she wasn't triumphant. That's the look thing I keep coming back to. She didn't have the look of a person who just won something. She had the look of a person who spent 40 minutes describing a place that almost killed her. To a room full of people who were going to send other people there in 26 hours. She stopped in the hallway, looked at nothing for a moment. Then she looked at me. I've a reputation in this unit for being invisible. It's not a reputation I've cultivated so much as one that comes naturally from the combination of medium height, forgettable features, and a habit of standing against walls with a notebook. I'm, as one sergeant once described me, the kind of guy you forget is in the room until he writes something down about you. "You were out here the whole time," she said. "Yes, ma'am." She looked at the notebook, then at me. "You writing a book or something?" "I don't know yet," I said, which was honest. She almost smiled. It was a small thing, barely a movement, really. More like the idea of a smile that stopped just short of manifesting. Get some sleep, kind of. "A captain." She said captain the way people say it when they're being simultaneously formal, personal, which is a skill I've only ever seen in a few people. She walked away, muddy boot and straight spine, not hurrying. To be fair, I wrote 1,131. She walked west, I didn't sleep. I pulled the operational folder, what I was cleared for, which was most of it now. That Adeyemi had pretty much. I restructured the classification, and I sat in the S1 office with my functional coffee, and I read through the ridgeline approach 3 times. She was right about the shelf formation, and the aerial was wrong. I also found in the appendix of the 3rd previous attempt a sentence that stopped me cold, buried in a casualty footnote. Not the main text, which the footnote. Approach vectors discounted based on early cycle reconnaissance. A western ridgeline assessed as non-viable without further verification. Verification not requested, which not requested. Not impossible, not dangerous, not beyond scope, not requested. Plus, I clicked my pen for a long time looking at that sentence. The fluorescent tube in the S1 office doesn't flutter. It just hums. Constant, low. The kind of sound that fills a silence without fixing it. I wrote, someone already knew about the western ridgeline. I wrote, someone chose not to ask. And I didn't write the next logical sentence. I didn't need to. The notebook doesn't need everything spelled out. Plus, sometimes the gap between 2 written sentences is the most important thing in the notebook. Outside, the base had gone to its version of quiet, generators, distant radio chatter, the mechanical sound of something being loaded or unloaded somewhere in the motor pool. 26 hours from now, Sella Marks would be on a ridgeline she'd memorized in November, and in the cold under 30 kilos, leading an element through an approach that 3 separate planning cycles had called non-viable, because they hadn't asked. Because she hadn't been in the room, and I closed the folder, drank the functional coffee. It tasted like it always tasted, like something that had decided to be coffee and then thought better of it halfway through. I opened a new page in the notebook. At the top I wrote, Terrace, H26, plus Western Approach. And then I started writing down everything I knew because that's all I can do. Because somewhere, to be honest, in the valley 12 hours out, there's a ridgeline that exists and matters and was almost lost in a footnote. I write it down. I always write it down. Plus, the radio went quiet at 0217 and I felt it in my sternum before I understood it with my brain. Not static quiet, not signal loss quiet. The specific quiet of a transmission that had been mid-sentence and then wasn't. More like a sentence that gets its last 3 words cut off, and the words that made it to you were fine, were normal, were just. Position updates, element 2, moving through the saddle, contact neg. And then the space where the rest of the sentence was supposed to be. I was in the TOC. I'm always in the TOC. My natural habitat is a room full of screens and radio equipment and people who haven't slept enough, drinking functional coffee and logging things. I'd been awake for 22 hours, which my pen was in my left hand. The notebook was open on the desk beside the frequency board. I'd 6 pages already, which was a lot for a pre-dawn operation, which meant I'd been nervous. The radio operator, Specialist Ortega, who has the quality of seeming 14 years old, while also being completely unflappable, which is a combination that either means he's very young or he's extremely good at this, looked at his board, didn't panic. Looked at it the way you look at a car engine when it makes a sound you haven't heard before and you're trying to decide if it's new problem or old problem you just noticed. Say again, element 2. He said it conversationally, like he was asking someone to repeat an order. Nothing. 20 seconds, plus, element 2, radio check. Nothing. I wrote 0217 and then silence, and then I wrote do not speculate because my brain was already speculating. I've a rule about keeping the speculation out of the notebook until I've something to base it on. Colonel Adeyemi was in the TOC. He'd been in the corner with his own coffee for 2 hours reading, occasionally looking at the map table, occasionally not. He looked up at the radio now, and he didn't move. He just looked. and the looking had a quality of weight to it. "Alternative frequency," he said, and Ortega was already switching. "Here's what I pieced together over the next 3 hours. But from the radio traffic and Adeyemi's read-alouds from the field reports, and the one direct SAT call from Sela herself that came in at 0244, which I will get to. Element 1, 12 soldiers, attached combat engineers, Western Ridgeline approach, had moved through the first 2/3 of the shelf formation clean. Sela's shelf formation, the one the aerial had called non-viable. It had been navigable, and she had been right about that with the precision of someone who'd memorized it by surviving it, which is the most reliable kind of precision theirs. Element 2, the flanking unit, 6 soldiers from the attached Ranger Company, had moved through the saddle as planned. Contact negative until they hadn't been. The ambush had been in the saddle and not at the ridge line, not at the, objective corridor. In the saddle, and which Sela had flagged in the briefing as a sound amplification point, which was in the record, which someone had annotated as noted and then, from the look of the flanking route, not incorporated. 2 men down. Non-fatal, the first report said. Then the second report said one was serious. The corridor objective was 400 meters east of where Element 2 now was, pinned, unable to push forward without exposing the casualty, unable to pull back without losing the approach window. On Element 1, Sela's element, was on the ridgeline with eyes on the objective and no clear path to supporting Element 2 without compromising the strike angle. The operation had 32 minutes before the approach window closed with first light. I did not write this as going wrong in the notebook. I wrote down times and grid references, which is the same thing, factually. The SAT call came in at 0244. Adeyemi took it at the map table. And I was close enough to hear her voice through the handset. Not the words, just the register of it, which was steady in the specific way that people are steady when steadiness is an act of will rather than an absence of fear. Adeyemi listened, said nothing for 40 seconds, and then, "Walk me through your sight line to the saddle." More from her. I caught fragments. Shelf drops about 30 meters, but there's a spine running north-southwest. A clean angle on the lower saddle from the second waypoint. I can put 2 shooters on that spine and suppress the contact point long enough for 2 to pull the casualty back and reposition. "What does it cost you?" Her response was shorter. I didn't catch the words. I, caught the tone, which was the tone of a person who has already done the arithmetic and is delivering the result without editorializing. Adeyemi looked at the map. Looked at the time, and his face did nothing visible, which in my experience means everything internal was moving very fast. "Do it," he said. He handed the handset back to Ortega, stood at the map table for a moment. Then he said, to no one in particular, to the room, "Element 1 is going to suppress from the ridgeline spine. 2 well, pulls back, reposition north. We lose the eastern breach, but we get a northern entry point if they move in the next." He checked his watch. 23 minutes. Major Farrell, and who had materialized from somewhere behind me, said, "The northern entry puts them at the second guard position." "Yes," said Adeyemi. A beat. "The northern entry is also not in the original plan, which means it's not in whatever they have prepared for the original plan." Farrell looked at the map, looked at Adeyemi, gave the smallest possible nod, which in this room, at this hour, was equivalent to a standing ovation. I wrote 0244. Adeyemi restructures in real time. TBH, northern entry. 23 minutes. I wrote, marks on the spine. The next 18 minutes were the kind that age you. I've logged enough operations to have a sense of time in the talk. How it moves, how it distorts, how a minute with radio silence is structurally different from a minute with continuous traffic. These 18 minutes had both. patches of silence that landed like held breath. Then Ortega's honestly voice, calm as a man reading a grocery list, relaying position updates from Element 1 as they moved from the second waypoint to the spine. At 0251, Element 2's radio came back. Not clean. There was static, and Sergeant First Class Dennis Webb, who was the E2 element leader, was transmitting through what I later learned was a cracked handset held together with 2 fingers and a force of will. But it came back. Webb's voice had the particular quality of a man who is hurt and not saying so. We have one urgent, one priority. We can move. At which tell me where. Ortega told him where. At 0253, 2 shots. On the ridge. Sharp. Spaced. And the kind of space that means deliberate, aimed, chosen, not suppressing fire, not a firefight, 2 shots placed by someone who had looked through a scope and made a decision about geometry. The contact on Element 2 stopped. Webb said, "Moving." I write down times. I always write down times. But sitting in that talkie in the hum of the generators and the stutter of the screens, I wrote 0253, and I stopped. I held the pen against the page without moving it for a moment, because some facts have a weight to them that you need to hold before you can write them down. 2 shots. 2 shots, kind of. From a ridgeline that the aerial imagery had called non-viable, that 3 planning cycles had called non-viable, that a room full of officers had almost never heard described because the person who'd walked it was standing outside the door. I wrote the number. I moved on. And the corridor strike happened at 0307. I'm not going to describe it in detail because I wasn't there, and detail I wasn't there for is speculation, and I've a rule. What the radio traffic told me was this: Element 2 repositioned north in 17 minutes, which isn't slow for a unit moving a stretcher through pre-dawn mountain terrain. And when they hit the northern entry, it was undefended. But because it was not in the plan that anyone had prepared for except Sela Marks, who had looked at the map in a briefing room and said the northern entry if we lose the eastern breach, and Adeyemi, who had listened and filed it. The corridor was disrupted. Both elements pulled back clean. 1 urgent casualty medevaced at 0341. 1 priority, I think, treated on site, stable. The after-action would later describe it as operationally successful with adjusted parameters due to contact in the approach. I'd describe it as a thing that almost didn't happen at all. Sela came into the FOB at 0512. I was still in the TOC. I'd been in the TOC for 7 hours. I'd honestly 4 cups of functional coffee in me and the specific hollow feeling behind my eyes that comes from sustained concentration releasing all at once, like a fist unclenching. The notebook had 12 pages now. Plus, my pen had been clicked so many times the button was making a sound it hadn't made before, a slightly different register, a looser click, like something had shifted in the mechanism. She came in with her element. 8 soldiers, all present, all vertical, which after an operation like this is the specific version of success that matters most. She had a cut on the side of her neck that someone had taped with a field dressing and which she was clearly not going to mention unless someone asked directly. Her eyes had the distant, inward quality of a person whose brain was still on the ridgeline. Adeyemi was there. He'd been in the TOC for the whole 7 hours. He'd had his own coffee. Real coffee, I noticed, from a thermos his aide had brought at some point, and he'd gone quiet about 40 minutes before the elements returned, which in my experience means he was doing the internal version of writing things down. He stood when she came in. She stopped and looked at him. She was still in full kit, still had the weight of the pack on her, and there was mud on her uniform from the waist down. Not the dried mud from yesterday, fresh mud, which told you something about the ridgeline conditions that no aerial imagery could have. Northern entry was clean, she said. They didn't have it covered. I know, said Adeyemi. Whilst I was listening. A pause. The spine gave me a clean angle on the saddle contact. 2 shooters. I put Martinez on the second position. She paused. He was good. I'll note that. Another pause. Longer. The kind where both people are saying something with the silence. Sir, she said, which? The saddle. It was in the briefing notes. I know. It was in the record. I know. He said it the same way both times, but the second time had something heavier in it. That's a separate problem. Not yours to carry tonight. She looked at him for a moment. Then she did the same almost smile I'd seen in the hallway the day before. The one that stopped just short of happening, that lived in the space between deciding to smile and actually doing it. Get some sleep, Lieutenant, he said. Yes, sir. She turned to go. Honestly, stopped, turned back. Captain. She was looking at me. I was still at my desk with my notebook open and my deteriorating pen and 12 pages of the night. You're still here? Yes, ma'am. She looked at the notebook, then at the pen. You should get a better pen, she said. I looked at the pen. It basically had, objectively, been through a lot. Probably, I said. Plus, she left. I stayed in the TOC until 0700 because the after-action reporting structure requires a continuous log, and my log had the cleanest record of the night's timeline. And at 700, Ortega came in for his shift change, looked at me and said, with the specific tone of someone stating a fact rather than offering a courtesy, "You look terrible, sir." I told him I felt fine. He very diplomatically did not respond to that. I took the notebook back to my bunk, sat on the, basically, edge of it with the 12 pages and the pen that now clicked differently. The bass was coming up into its morning rhythm. Vehicles moving, mess hall noise, and someone shouting something about an inventory discrepancy in the motor pool that felt very far away from the valley and the saddle, and 2 shots in the dark. I opened the notebook to the last written page. At the bottom I'd logged 0512. Element 1, Element 2, RTB, all present. Below that, I'd written something and then crossed it out. I'd crossed it out while writing it, which I almost never do, which means I wrote it and immediately decided it was too editorial for the factual record. And I can still, read it through the cross-out. I left it visible. It says, the footnote almost won. The after-action report for Operation Terrace runs to 31 pages. Page 17 notes that the Western Ridgeline approach proved viable and contributed quite a bit to operational success. Page 22 notes the ambush in the saddle and flags it as an intelligence gap in approach route analysis. Page 22 does not note that. The saddle vulnerability had been in the briefing notes. Page 22 does basically not note who identified it. I've it in the notebook. I've the timestamp and the quote and the map reference and the room it was set in and who was sitting at the table and who had been standing outside the door 11 minutes before. I always write it down, not because anyone will read the notebook, not because it will change the 31 pages, which are already filed, which are already correct in all the ways that official documents are correct, because somewhere between contact neg and the silence that swallowed the rest of that sentence, in a valley that reads as non-viable on the aerial imagery and isn't, a woman climbed a ridgeline she had memorized in November in -14 degrees and put 2 shots into the dark and brought 8 people home. The record should have that. Someone should have that, and I turned off the light. Actually, outside, the generators hummed. Somewhere in the motor pool, the inventory discrepancy was apparently still ongoing. I closed the notebook. I did not sleep as well as I should have.